In February 2012, following England's comfortable qualification to the upcoming European Championships, Fabio Capello took the decision to resign as England manager. His decision was not based on performance but one of anger, as the FA took the decision to strip John Terry of the captaincy without consulting Capello. The Italian lambasted the FA for undermining his authority as manager and felt he'd been shown a complete lack of trust and respect on the matter. It was certainly shocking, but many England supporters were happy to see the back of Capello, who in spite of having a strong competitive record of just 2 defeats in 42 matches, had majorly under-delivered at the 2010 World Cup. The ramifications of this though were great and left the FA scrambling for a manager just 4 months before the start of UEFA Euro 2012. But the choice was clear, wasn't it? In the days after, one name was consistently spoken about in regards to the vacant England manager position, to a point where some journalists had even begun to talk about him as if he had already secured the job. That man was Harry
I'm not a weekend dude.
Redknapp.
Nah, fuck off.
The clamour for this man at this time was undeniable. Fans were calling for him, the media was doing his bidding for him, it was a frenzy. Big public figures in the England sphere had cited their support for him becoming the next Three Lions boss, including Gary Lineker, Alan Shearer, Ian Wright, former managers Graham Taylor and Sven-Goran Eriksson, and even some of the players. Both Rio Ferdinand and Wayne Rooney, 2 players still within the England setup, had actively called for his appointment. What were the FA even deliberating for? The next England manager would be Roy Hodgson. Okay, no one expected that, but let's unpack some of the FA's reasons here that led to this surprising snubbing of Harry Redknapp. The FA were undoubtedly left reeling from Capello's departure. Things had gotten out of hand towards the end of his reign, with power struggles and public embarrassment. The FA were determined to return to an even footing. They did not want another outspoken ego, they wanted a company man. Redknapp was known for being charismatic, displaying colourful language sometimes, and being too populist. In other words, he may be difficult to control. Alongside this, Redknapp had only just been acquitted for tax evasion days before Capello's resignation. They were fearful of appointing another manager who could be seen as a PR risk, especially when Hodgson's reputation was spotless. The FA had ultimately decided that in spite of Redknapp being the people's choice, they would rather prioritise control and predictability. Pundits were rather scathing at this time, believing the FA didn't pick the best man for the job, but instead the man that would cause them the least problems. The FA instead saw a man willing to protect their image and work within the structures. That wasn't to say Hodgson didn't have his merits though, as Roy sat at the press conference table beaming from ear to ear. FA chief David Bernstein was keen to transpire the various accolades attributed to the departing West Brom manager. Yes, he was a safe pair of hands, but he was also an accomplished coach who had experiences far outweighing many other candidates. At the time of his appointment, Hodgson had already managed 3 international nations: the United Arab Emirates, Finland, and most notably Switzerland, where he took a struggling nation from 83rd to 3rd in the FIFA World Rankings, qualifying them for both the 1994 World Cup and Euro 96. Elsewhere, he'd also won titles with FC Copenhagen and managed Inter Milan in the mid-90s to moderate success. In more recent times, he'd shown his acumen in improving middling Premier League sides such as West Brom and Fulham, who he also took to an impressive Europa League final. There were some alarm bells though from his time in charge of Liverpool, where his 6-month stint never seemed to take off and he was promptly sacked only halfway through the season. Nevertheless though, in spite of the fact he wasn't the choice of the media, fans or players, he was the FA's choice, on a 4-year contract no less. Would Roy be the man to take England to glory? Well, the first attempts at success would come far sooner than most, as England kicked off their Euro 2012 campaign just 41 days after Hodgson was announced as the new Three Lions gaffer. You could see this either as a baptism of fire or a complete free hit, but I think it's clear that it was the latter. He assembled his squad, and it was clear that England were at a point of renewal. Gerrard, Ashley Cole and John Terry were there, but now creeping into their 30s, while Lampard and Ferdinand missed out on the tournament. England were drawn into a group comprising themselves, France, Sweden and Ukraine, one of the tournament hosts. Expectation had been majorly dampened as we headed for Roy's first foray as England boss. The opening match saw England take on France in Donetsk, a repeat of their opening match at Euro 2004 8 years earlier. That match saw an 18-year-old Wayne Rooney terrorise France's backline before England threw it all the way in stoppage time. This match would be far less eventful. Both nations had torrid times at the 2010 World Cup, and as such, both sides were going through teething pains of rebuilding. Jovian Lescott opened the scoring in this one on the 30-minute mark as a Gerrard free kick was nodded home by the unmarked Everton defender to give Roy the perfect start to the match. This joy though would be short-lived as a low-driven Samir Nasri strike would equalise the game before the half was out. The second half was a much of a muchness, both sides seeming happy to settle for a point. The next two matches would be pivotal though to England's hopes of topping the group as they first took on Sweden. Andy Carroll would be picked to start in this one, an inspired choice as he gave England the lead in the first half of this one. The second half though would see this match come to life as England saw their lead turned on its head before the hour mark. A major double error from Glenn Johnson saw him fail to play the offside trap before turning the ball into his own net, and then the towering gladiator of Olof Mellberg sent Sweden ahead. Roy would have to turn to his bench and opted for Arsenal winger Theo Walcott, who equalised just 3 minutes later before assisting the winner with Danny Welbeck turning in his cross. England looked good to go through if they could withstand the hosts of Ukraine in their final match. A return for Wayne Rooney was welcomed in this one as he netted the only goal of this match, his first at an international tournament since Euro 2004. Though this match wasn't without its controversy as Ukraine was denied a goal following John Terry's heroic goal line clearance, which when replayed showed that the ball had actually already crossed the line. Nevertheless though, England had done what they would need to do, and with France faltering to Sweden, they topped the group in rather impressive fashion. Any hopes of an easy quarter-final tie though were scuppered. They would be facing a resurgent Italy side looking to right their wrongs from their dismal 2010 World Cup display. This match would remain goalless all the way through to penalties, but that did not tell the story of how dominant Italy were in this one. England could barely muster a shot, Pirlo was pulling the strings and frustration was rife. If there's one thing that England fans were desperate to avoid though, it was penalties. Just ask Chris Kamara's criminally underrated England Euro 2012 charity single.
All we're asking of you, please, no red cards or penalties.
Unfortunately, inevitability cannot be avoided and Italy won the shootout, Pirlo dropping a Panenka on Joe Hart just to rub salt into the wounds. And just like that, England were out. Hodgson's first tournament as manager was mixed to say the least. In a result sense, it was certainly acceptable. Topping a group including France and bowing out to a nation that would end up in the final was hardly cause for concern. Yet it was the style and manner of the performances that were alarming. England managed just 40% possession across the entire tournament, looking very passive in most matches. Expectations may have been met or even slightly exceeded, but this was uninspiring to say the least, and probably one of the most forgettable England tournaments of all time. Though in saying this, goodwill was still in the bank for Roy. He had only just taken over and had yet to put his mark on the team. Next time out though, he would not be afforded the same level of grace. The period in between Euro 2012 and the 2014 World Cup gave an opportunity for Roy to stamp his mark on the team ahead of his next major obstacle. The likes of Terry and Ferdinand were out, Ashley Cole and Frank Lampard had their roles diminished as a new set of England players were on the horizon. Ross Barkley, Adam Lallana, Raheem Sterling, Andros Townsend, Ricky Lambert and Jay Rodriguez came into the fold, and this is where I want to make my first defence of Hodgson. The players going out and the players coming in were undoubtedly of differing levels of quality. From Terry and Ferdinand as stalwart England centre-halves to Jagielka and Cahill was a noticeable drop in quality. I don't want to lament too hard because they were still established Premier League defenders, but it was clear that the hand Roy was dealt was not the same as what Capello had drawn in 2008. Qualifying as usual for England took care of itself, but the friendlies in this time period were of note. Sweden's infamous 4-2 win featuring that Ibrahimovic goal came in November 2012 before England delivered one of their best ever wins in June 2013, defeating Brazil 2-1 at Wembley with Lampard scoring his own wonder goal. With the hosts and favourites for the 2014 World Cup taken out, optimism for Roy's England began to take hold as the Three Lions were heading for South America. Though some optimism may have come crumbling down when England were drawn into Group D alongside Costa Rica, Italy and Uruguay. The Azzurri had totally outclassed England 2 years earlier at Euro 2012. Uruguay had shown their quality at the 2010 World Cup, finishing third, and they had the all-important danger man of Luis Suarez, who had spent the last 9 months terrorising Premier League defences. And Costa Rica, well, they were being dismissed, a sentiment that I'm sure won't age terribly. Yet still, this was a renewed England, wasn't it? Fresh blood was here, Sterling and Sturridge were off the back of a masterful season with Liverpool, and Rooney was still only 28. This had to be his tournament. The cold isolation of Capello had gone. Roy was ushering a new, maybe even relaxed era. The media wasn't expecting, so the young Lions could be fearless, because England were improving, weren't they? Italy were first on the agenda, a chance to right the wrongs of 2 years earlier. Roy's decision to start Sterling in the 10 and Rooney off the left was seen as bold and perplexing to others, but he seems a tactical genius when Raheem sent England ahead 3 minutes in. Oh wait, no he didn't. His fierce drive had me celebrating on my mate's pool table. It was only moments after being coated in stale lager that we all realised that the ball had actually hit the side netting, and it was still 0-0. It wouldn't remain that way though, as half hour in saw the opening goal. The magnificent Pirlo causing trouble once again, as his dummy paved the way for Marchisio to snag a pile driver from 25 yards. The scoreline would level itself up just 2 minutes later though, as a truly brilliant move from England saw Rooney tee up Sturridge to notch an equaliser. Somehow though, in spite of the fact England were putting up a much better fight than they had 2 years earlier, it always felt that Italy had Roy's number, as Super Mario found the winner early in the second half with a close range header. England would do all they could to push for a second leveller, which included some enthusiastic language from Joe Hart towards the ball boys. But nevertheless, this performance may have been improved, but the result hadn't changed. Uruguay were next. After an opening match hiccup, there were renewed calls for optimism in this one, because maybe Uruguay were actually a bit rubbish? I mean, they had to be. They lost 3-1 in the opener to Costa Rica, who we all know are the whipping boys of the group. However, Suarez was back fit for this one, and the match for both sides was do or die. A loss for either would likely be the end of their tournament. The good news for England was they started lively in this one. Rooney going close twice with a free kick and a header that crashed off the woodwork, only for a familiar face to unravel their back line. Suarez peeled off his marker with exceptional movement and nodded in an opener, as England would once again have to deal with going 1-0 behind. Their response though was good. Rooney continued to be a threat, and finally in his third tournament he got his first World Cup goal. It was a weight off for England's record scorer. Finally his moment had arrived, and with 15 left they had time to push for a much needed winner. Except it wouldn't be them finding the winner, it would be Uruguay, and more poignantly, it would be that man again, Luis Suarez. A Route 1 clearance from Muslera was flicked into the path of Suarez, who buried his effort masterfully. Truly one of the game's greatest finishers. I'm sure he wouldn't do anything absolutely mental in the final group match that would overshadow his performances. But that was that. England were out. Roy had failed. Yes, the performances had been improved, but results are results, and it turned out that the group whipping boys of Costa Rica were actually a hell of a lot better than England. Who knew? Roy would have to face the wrath of the FA when he returns home to Blighty, knowing he was undoubtedly getting the sack. Oh wait, no he wasn't. Despite scathing reviews from the press, anger from the fans, the FA were pretty relaxed with the job Hodgson had been doing. They saw the 2014 World Cup as a learning experience for many of this young team's futures. FA chairman Greg Dyke saw the performances as encouraging and wanted Roy to see the job through, since he had a contract until the end of Euro 2016, which would have meant a hefty payoff to sack him now. And let's not forget, Roy was the company man. He handled himself in diplomatic situations with class and aplomb, and after the debacles with Capello, McLaren and Sven, the FA wanted continuity. The decision was a brave one, but one which actually had sound support from England supporters. Yes, they were angry at the end of the tournament, but that frustration dissipated fast, and in the cold light of day, an overwhelming majority felt he should remain in post, especially since England had played better than expected, even if results hadn't matched the performances. All eyes would instead turn towards UEFA Euro 2016. It was now or never for Hodgson. Now, qualification for UEFA Euro 2016 was perfect. I mean, literally, 10 wins from 10, 31 goals scored, 3 conceded. Couldn't ask for more, right? Add in a couple of morale boosting wins over Scotland at Celtic Park and Germany away, England looked in a very good place. Vardy, Ali, Dyer and Kane were looking like forces to be reckoned with. Rooney would be made captain as Lampard and Gerrard walked away from the fold to usher in a new era, away from the anything but golden generation. But none of this was new. We knew England could be flat-track bullies in qualification, but crucially, they were brittle when it mattered. Nevertheless, England were heading for France. There was renewed optimism, but Hodgson had to make progress this time round. Russia, Slovakia and Wales would be their group opponents, and realistically, Roy couldn't ask for better than that. This was a slam dunk of a group, a far cry from France at Euro 2012 and Italy and Uruguay at the 2014 World Cup. Tactically, it was clear though that Hodgson hadn't made up his mind. Vardy, Kane and Ali were off the back of phenomenal seasons, but he also had Rooney knocking about. Sterling was a talent, and he had a little soft spot for Lallana too. How would he fit them all in without compromising the balance? Well, he made a calculation that Dyer as a lone holding midfielder could be enough to simply overwhelm nations, particularly in a weaker group. Let's see how that would pan out with Russia first to play. Well, the build-up to this match was marred by clashes between England and Russian fans, but it didn't stop a buoyant England side from controlling proceedings. Movement across the front line looked fluid, chances were aplenty, but goals were missing. However, in this 73rd minute, finally a breakthrough was found as Eric Dyer lashed in a free kick to give England a very deserved lead. Unfortunately, as is so often the case with the Three Lions, a gut puncher was always likely to follow. Berezutski rose above Danny Rose and his header drifted over Hart into the net. It was the same old England, but supporters had a rather different question on their lips. What on earth was Harry Kane taking corners for? It wasn't even as if England were lacking in set piece takers. It was completely inexcusable, and made even funnier when 2 years later Kane would score from a corner in their opening World Cup match. Wales followed, who had gotten themselves off to a fine start beating Slovakia. Roy knew the knives would be well and truly out if England were to capitulate again. But in spite of this, he stuck with the same team that had dominated for the most part over Russia. The first half of this one saw the Three Lions becoming unstuck, toothless even, and just before the break, Bale struck a 35-yard free kick into the net, which Hart probably should have done better from. Hodgson had to dig himself out here. He was staring at a monumental failure and decided Vardy and Sturridge were coming on for Kane and Sterling. That move was inspired as the Leicester goalscorer was in the right place at the right time to find an equaliser before that spine-tingling winner. Sturridge picks up the ball outside the area, plays a quick ball into Vardy, he lays it off to Ali, and with a nice flick it goes back to Sturridge, who pokes the ball into the net, prompting England's pandemonium. Sturridge brought out the dancing, Neville ran from the dugout, and Rooney fully shreked it up. At last, England had arrived. This was the turning point, lift off for their campaign, watch out Euro 2016. And then they followed it up with one of the most drab games of the entire tournament. Hodgson made changes in this one. Kane, Sterling, Rooney, Walker, Ali and Rose all came out to keep players fresh, but it ultimately led to England looking disjointed, lacking in rhythm and chemistry. Slovakia knew a draw would be enough to get them into the next round, a major success for them, and played as such. The result would ultimately cost England the group win, falling instead to Wales, who dusted themselves off to deliver a great 3-0 victory over Russia. The fear was that England would now get a tougher last 16 tie. Portugal were a potential opponent, but Lady Luck appeared to be shining on Roy, as instead England were favourably lined up against Iceland in their first knockout round. And Hodgson too was pretty brazen in his post-game remarks that England were ready to make someone pay, that some nation would find themselves on the end of a tough result. We'll see about that. As England headed for Nice ahead of their quote-unquote easiest knockout match in living memory, it was now or never for Roy Hodgson. Sterling and Sturridge occupied the sides, Kane down the middle with Ali and Rooney in behind. Were England about to make someone pay? Well, it certainly looked like it when 4 minutes in, Sterling latched onto a bouncing ball, only to be felled by the Icelandic keeper, resulting in an early penalty. Rooney stepped up and dispatched as expected. Hodgson's boys were on their way. Though the lead wouldn't last long, Ragnar Sigurdsson would find an equaliser just 2 minutes later, the Three Lions backline being completely undone by a routine long throw-in, as the score was even once more. It was just a setback though. Roy's boys had the quality to overcome this, right? Well, 10 minutes later, it was 2-1, just not to England's, as Sigursson's low drive narrowly rolled into the corner despite a hard touch. It was an earth-shattering goal. Icelandic fans in disbelief, England looked utterly shell-shocked. Even Steve McLaren couldn't believe his eyes. And most imperative, it was a scoreline that would hold. England were out. Honestly, in all my years of watching England at multiple tournaments, I've never seen a performance quite like this one. A team that looked so utterly dejected, so devoid of any ideas, so lacking in identity and belief. The players looked beaten to a pulp at the full-time whistle. A culmination of lacklustre performance after lacklustre performance for years from England had just hit its lowest ebb. Now the question remains, what would Roy do next? Well, he came wandering down to his post-match press conference, a piece of paper came out of his pocket and he began to read. He spoke at great length, thanking his staff and his players, but ultimately accepted he must resign from the post. Now this was baffling. Not that he had resigned, because that was obvious, but the fact he seemed to remarkably have a prepared statement just minutes after full time. The words were almost inflammatory with how diplomatic they were. I find it really hard to quantify how I feel about it. He didn't put a spin on it, he didn't throw out any excuses, yet somehow it still felt utterly hollow and lacking in responsibility. Now, was this because he was a broken man, or was this a coward's way out? Was he just trying to beat the FA to the punch? He'd been in the job for 4 years and had effectively no legacy. No knockout wins, England's worst World Cup ever. Okay, he bridged the gap between the old guard and the new, but to what success? Then just like that, he slinks down to the press with a shrug and a sigh, with a pre-written resignation. McLaren and Capello had big blow-up-in-your-face type failures, but this was passive and kind of pathetic. It was an era of boredom and apathy for supporters. We had young, dynamic talent and somehow never saw anything substantial. Roy was the England manager no one wanted, and his biggest achievement in 4 years was just about managing to do enough to avoid being sacked. Either that or Kane on corners. The FA had delivered 3 failing managers in a row. Surely they wouldn't embroil themselves in another controversy before the year was out. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for watching.